Welcome to MAP, the bi-weekly market access podcast hosted by me, Dr. Stefan Walzer. I am the innovator of Market Access 4.0 and a health economist by training and working in the fields of market access, reimbursement, pricing, and health economics since 2004. Discover Market Access 4.0 and unveil the future with our innovative solutions. Max Insights, our fast and easy AI-based reimbursement planning platform. Dobo, our new revolutionizing way of creating reimbursement dossiers across the globe with the first and only dossier writing AI bot. Cubo, our new AI-based objection handling platform. And Waffle, train with Waffle's virtual reality genius in an immersive environment and with an AI-based counterpart. We are Market Access 4.0. So check out our website, marketaccess4-0.com. And now let's dive into the current discussions, processes, and trends in market access across the globe. Welcome to another episode of the Market Access podcast. Today we're going to speak about an important but sometimes maybe also topic where and what maybe people want to avoid a bit, which is statistics and market access. I think it's a key topic anyway. And for that, I have invited Necdet Gunsoy, who is a statistician. But before I would probably introduce yourself with all of your experience and everything, maybe Necdet, if you could introduce yourself, the listeners can also know with whom I'm speaking and who is basically giving them the brilliant answers.
Hi, Stefan. Thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, so I'm Necdet Gunsoy. I'm a statistician by training, let's say, but I've worked in pharma across statistics, obviously, but most of my time has been spent kind of in HOR, real-world evidence, HTA, and market access. So though I started in more technical roles, I kind of moved through different teams, kind of ending up in strategic roles as well. So that's sort of given me the perspective of the whole journey within those teams and understanding a little bit where gaps are in terms of different aspects of relationships between teams. Since leaving pharma, I've set up my own consultancy. It's Evimed. So Evimed is a boutique technical consultancy which is specialized in health economics outcomes research, real-world evidence, health technology assessment, and market access. And a lot of what we do is really thinking about how you can set something global, a global vision, a global strategy, and then how that is then executed locally in a way that's aligned with that strategy. And a lot of that is kind of the marriage between technical aspects of how you execute a piece of work, but also making sure that the way you're technically executing is still aligned with that strategy. And that's where I think a lot of challenges arise within teams and within relationships between teams in making sure that that is the case.
Very good. I think that's a great intro, and it shows also that, let's say, you are probably the real best person to speak about not only statistics, but also the overall kind of, let's say, collaboration, deliverables, the strategic insights, because everything is linked with each other. And I mean, you have also mentioned HOR, where you have also been. And I mean, if I take, for example, my own experience as well, where I worked quite closely with very good statisticians as well when I was in the industry, when they basically then built the health economic models for the strategy, also then later on, obviously, for the submission of the countries. What are your kind of maybe recommendations or your experience as well? How could basically statisticians and market access managers work most effectively together, especially maybe thinking about the health economics component of it, which is not, let's say, the pure data analysis of a clinical trial. You have a protocol and everything. It can also be a bit more flexible. Maybe, let's say, there are also different guides and different regulations for various countries, etc. So what are your key recommendations or your experience as well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So health economics is a bit of a special case, right? Because as you said, it's not traditional statistics, and often you have people that are specialized in the health economics. But there are two sides to the health economics piece, right? There's the economic model, which usually is in Excel. You can use other software as well, but usually is in Excel. And those are built generally by people who know how to use Excel, and they will be kind of economic modelers, right? They wouldn't be statisticians. However, there's a lot of data from the trials that needs to go into the economic model, where depending on companies, depending how they're set up, depending who they work with, statisticians working on the trials might actually be best placed to actually conduct those analyses. And, I guess in the past, it can be difficult, sharing data, transferring data, and some companies, they opt for, clinical trial analyses only being done by the stats team. And that's where this communication aspect is very important, right? Because not only are you asking the statistician to do something they probably haven't done before, you're also asking for maybe a lot. And again, depending on whether these statisticians are dedicated to supporting market access or medical affairs, or whether they're also working on regulatory filings, they will be busy with other things. And that's really the challenging aspect of all of this kind of HTA preparation in general, but also applies to economic modeling.
Yeah, no, I agree. I would also say, I think a lot of times it's exactly what you have just described, what we have as well seen. I mean, one is data access, where maybe the statistician within the HOR department maybe do not have automatic kind of access to, where then it's more the kind of question, why do you need that? What do you want to do? I mean, is that according to protocol, which a lot of times is obviously not. So that's a lot of those kind of questions, right? It was not powered for those kind of things. So I think that's important. I mean, important is probably also here, which is probably true for any kind of, let's say, cooperation, collaboration, speak to the people, meet the people, explain them what you need and why you need it. And of course, especially in large organizations, you maybe as well need a process in place that either the statisticians generally not dedicated to HOR know that they would also need to run those analyses, that it's clear that it's in their kind of, let's say, shop in a way. But of course, as well, from the other perspective, that there's maybe at least a process of requesting data or requesting analysis and all of the like. So yeah, I would agree.
So you can help a lot with education, right? I think a lot of the challenges stem from lack of mutual understanding and general lack of foundational knowledge on how the other function works. So it's reciprocal. As much for statisticians trying to understand how HTA works, how pricing and reimbursement, market access works, but also for market access colleagues to understand how statistics works and how it's executed, the operational aspects. So when you have that in place, it's much easier then to have conversations with statisticians, with broader teams as well, and especially when it comes to tackling prioritization, right? Because that's probably the main challenge that you would face when you're in market access or even HOR and you want a piece of work to be done. And alongside that, obviously processes help. And from my experience, I've helped implement kind of new processes to make sure that everything is in place to kind of avoid as many hurdles as possible when trying to have analyses complete for market access and reimbursement purposes. So that certainly helps as well. And from the market access perspective as well, it's very important also having the right people at the table as well, because sometimes they like to, let's say, pick on the statistician, but sometimes, not sometimes, actually always, there are, approval systems in place. The statistician can't do anything until they have an approval from, maybe generally the medical team or the asset lead or whatever. And so, from the market access perspective, it's important to know who has to be there when you're having that conversation, right? Because you need at least the person who's going to approve it to be there in the conversation, because then you're just going to have another conversation with the person who's actually approving it and explain again everything you've already explained to someone else. So, a lot of that comes with process, comes with, setting up maybe cross-functional teams, or at least knowing kind of who to contact when you're sending out emails, requests, just to make sure that you're getting things, that everything is as smooth and efficient as possible.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And I think you also touched with a very good and important point, which is, you call it education. You could also basically maybe move that even a bit further, which is more translation of the data or making a story up there, right? Because ultimately, let's say the data, so the clinical data or the core of the data would as well need to fit to, let's say, also the analysis / the health economic result and story within, right? I think, it doesn't make sense. If you try to make up an interesting health economic story, which hardly fit to the clinical data, and also the other way around. But that's sometimes also a bit tricky, right?
Yeah, and that's maybe when I was talking in the beginning of kind of what we do and what we really specialize in, it's that aspect, right? Sometimes, and that's a very challenging aspect, because not many, you need kind of like a very specific set of skills to be able to address these questions, right? The issue is maybe sometimes you have, let's say, core value messages or value messages, maybe medical, market access, payer perspective, whatever. You have these core value messages, and sometimes you don't have the data or the analysis that actually gives you the evidence base for that value message, right? And sometimes the data is there and all that has to be done is analyzed, but that bit of trying to figure out exactly how you're supposed to analyze the data, what data you're supposed to analyze, and how you present the results is kind of the bit where it's kind of the marriage of strategy and technical expertise, because that's the bit where exactly you sometimes will struggle to get the right evidence that fits within those messages. And a lot of what I do is, because that's where it happens. You have key messages, and then you translate those into an evidence plan, let's say, right? An evidence plan, which is more on the operational kind of executional side, but really figuring out then how you specify a scientific research question this time to fit a value message. That's the bit that's really tricky. And that is probably something you gain from, again, like you say, the knowledge, the expertise, and trying to understand how everything works. But also, it's also experience, right? I think that's really the most challenging aspect of, and where you get the most issues is actually figuring out what you actually have to do to be able to get that value message.
Yeah, no, fully agree. And it brings me back obviously to two other aspects. One is obviously, you mentioned as well planning, meaning it's not just that, let's say, market access is running one direction and statistics / medicals running to the other direction until, let's say, we're getting to the phase of preparing launch. I think that's most likely the wrong approach, I would say, and in most of the times at least, which is one thing. But I think it's also linked to probably more kind of cross-functional teams, right? It's not just, I think you said as well, alignment discussions and understanding and all the kind of stuff, which is obviously also more helpful when you are acting in a cross-functional team. But I think this is, at least from my experience, still not the standard in most of the companies, isn't it?
Yes. So yeah, you would need the right people at the table to discuss certain aspects, and you do need to do the planning, right? And like you say, all companies are different, right? Let's say they all operate a little bit differently, and they have different setups of teams, and they choose to insource or outsource different aspects of the work, right? So it's actually, it's I guess very variable in terms of how, what the right solution is. When you have these challenges in different companies, they'll have different sets of ways to deal with it. But in every case, right, obviously preparation is key. Working ahead is key. When it comes to economic modeling, at least, comparative effectiveness or indirect treatment comparisons, and let's say 60% of what you need for pricing, market access, HTA submissions, you can probably define up front. And then there's, maybe 40% that you is at risk. You may need it, you may not need it. What you need may change slightly, but there's a lot that you can pre-specify and do ahead of time. And that's where, planning is very important, because also when you plan, right, you can also address the gaps ahead of time. So, I don't know, if you need something to be done and actually there's a piece of capability missing in your organization, you can address that ahead of time. If you need to look for external support, you can address that. And also the forward planning is also very helpful in terms of, being able to do strategy, right? Because you need a minimum of data to be able to make an informed decision on what your final strategy is going to be. And that's why it's very important to prepare ahead, prioritize, right? And then make sure you have enough time to actually be able to define and refine all of your access strategies.
Yeah, I fully agree. And we have now spoken in the last couple of minutes a lot about the, let's say, internal discussions and alignment. Of course, you can also, and we should probably also speak and think a bit about external communication. Just as an example, if you run either a payer ad board or an ad board for health economic, or let's say generally for health economics, make it very broad, where obviously payers, payer proxies, but also physicians, KOLs will be in there, where I would say, most of them have decent understanding of statistics. Most of the times they are not experts. Most of the time they are not experts in health economics or health economic modeling as well. So at the end of the day, it's also, let's say, quite difficult to come up with such complex kind of issues to make it quite easy to understand, to digest as well from the audience, but I think also without kind of losing scientific rigor. So what are those kind of steps where you would say, either from your experience or how, let's say, the two functions, statistics plus health economics in a broader sense, payer strategy, should basically work together to really not losing that scientific rigor, but still be able to explain it in a quite simple way?
Yeah, I think this is the foundational challenge with all people who do technical work, right? And I think this is maybe it's a little bit philosophical, maybe it's a little bit kind of individual preferences as well. But I think as a general thing, what's important is to boil it down to what you actually need the input for, because the physician or the KOL or the payer or whatever, they don't need to understand everything that you're doing to be able to give you the answer to what you need. As a very simple example, right? Let's say you have an economic model and patients get treated with this new drug, and then you need to figure out, well, actually, what do you give after, right? They fail on the drug, what happens afterwards? You don't need to explain how an economic model works to a treating physician, to just ask them, okay, like your current practice, let's say you're giving patients this, okay, they fail, what do you do next? And then that's a very easy question for them to answer. What's important then is asking the questions correctly so that you're getting the information that you need. So in this case, it would be kind of things like, what are the different treatment options they would do? How often would they do them? And how long do they treat the patients for with that, right? And that's the quantitative information you would need in the model. And then that's it. Then, you wouldn't really need to explain then, anything about cost-effectiveness model. And, so a lot of the thing is to really think about, what do they actually need to answer and what do they need to know to answer that question? You don't need to explain, anything about the rest. If they're curious, you can take them aside and just talk to them about it. But I think that's the key point. And I think, thinking very carefully about how you ask questions is the very important side. And, I think, and unfortunately, it takes cross-functional collaboration, because not every statistician is going to be good at this. Not every health economist is going to be good at this. And so you need to make sure that you're working closely with, let's say, for example, medical affairs in this instance, if you're talking to KOLs, because if the medical affairs person doesn't understand the question, it's highly likely the KOL won't either. So I think you need to test these with them as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Absolutely. And I fully agree. It's basically kind of targeted communication. It's not it's the same thing if, let's say, probably one of our friends or relatives are asking what we are doing day by day, right? I normally do not get into the details. I just try to explain it very, very simple, that they understand it, and then that's fine. And if, as you said, someone would come up and maybe have a more detailed question, then you can obviously go a bit more into the detail, which is exactly the same thing if you speak and discuss with somebody more external. And I think it's a very good hint as well obviously maybe tested with kind of proxies from, let's say, from that group you will be speaking with, which are also available, let's say, in-house, so within the company. We have now spoken a lot about, let's say, alignment and let's say cooperation. I mean, where and when people basically as well work and speak together, there are also conflicts, which is normal, right? How or what are the most common kind of conflicts or misunderstandings, maybe rather, between statistics or statisticians and market access teams you have seen in the last couple of years, and how have these basically been resolved, or maybe how could you avoid that? So what are your recommendations on that? Because that's also part of the alignment piece in a way, right?
Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think the main source of conflict is what market access wants, when they're asking for it, and how they're asking for it, which is, again, causes kind of confusion and frustrations on the stat side. And then maybe also the stat side, not then kind of because they don't have the knowledge, not quite understanding what they're asking for, right? And so this is what market access can do, right? And this is based on my experiences. So when I began a role where part of my role was to kind of make sure that Stats was supporting the market access team with generating the evidence for HTA submissions, right? And the approach we took there was, one is, okay, so first understand what the statisticians are complaining about. And what they're complaining about is that we get a lot of last minute requests that are always urgent. There's never nothing that isn't urgent. Always urgent, always a lot. And then they don't really explain to us why they need it or whatever. And then we need to do it. And then it's like really hard to prioritize. And the complaint on the market access side is, whenever we ask for something, it always takes 3 months. So, and so we end up kind of like asking for a lot ahead of time and etc. So the solution we came up there is, obviously we had the kind of educational piece where we did kind of some market access training for the statisticians and some awareness around statistics for the market access teams. But the idea there was that there are 3 key things to being successful, right? One is obviously prepare ahead. So for example, we would go around speaking to affiliates, trying to understand what they think they'll need for their submission. We would come up ourselves with what we think we might need. We would consolidate those into a set of analyses that we would need. So that's the easy part. Then the second part is really then thinking about, okay, what is actually critical that you need? So there are certain things that you can say are critical, right? For example, maybe some subgroup analyses of the primary endpoint. Very important, because if you're deciding, am I going to go for reimbursement subgroup A or subgroup B? That's probably your first important question, let's say. You need the result. So that's very critical. What's not critical? Maybe it's like, the safety data in the subgroup, because if you're not going for the subgroup, you won't need the safety data. So there was this process of prioritizing then what we needed, right? So in terms of critical, in terms of things that we know will eventually need to go to a dossier, but isn't critical for strategy. So things that can be added, for example, 2 weeks before or 1 week before final review, like the safety tables, for example, right? Because, most often you already know what the benefit risk profile of the product is, and those subgroup analyses that you need in the submission aren't going to change the overall conclusions, hopefully, right? Normally 99.99% of the time. So there was this prioritization aspect, and then it was much easier to have conversations with statistics, because then we'd be like, okay, we only need 50 tables. That's the critical stuff, but we need them like a week after data readout or 2 weeks after data readout, like as soon as possible. So and then I think they're much more comfortable because, it's just, 50 tables, we can do that. And then it's like, then we can define timelines for the other ones. And it's then kind of much easier for them to then digest and understand. And, things work a lot more smooth then, right? Because you're avoiding, again, unnecessary work. You're avoiding as well, because what the statistician will do if they get a request for 1,000 outputs, they're going to assign it according to who's available, what's available. And what might happen is that they might send you the safety results first, right? Because maybe the person working on safety was the first one that was free. So they worked on that first. And, they send it to market access, and the market says, why did you send me this? I don't need this right now, right? And you want to avoid those things. So I think that's kind of what we came up with. And so really important to do the prioritization and be really cognizant of how resource intensive it is to actually generate statistical work, and then have kind of realistic timelines set up for everything else that you need. And also make sure that you have processes that are quite flexible. Because again, you have situations in HTA all the time, and you can imagine with JCA as well, if your PICO changes last minute, right? Suddenly you don't need all the other PICOs, right? Or you don't need some PICOs, and suddenly you need new PICOs, right? So even if you pre-specified those PICOs, you need to have systems in place that tell you, okay, well, right now you don't need to do these analyses anymore. Instead, I want you to do this one. So the processes need to be flexible enough that it allows for that, right? And that's an important shift for a statistician, because generally when statisticians write analysis plans, the idea is that they do everything that's in the plan, right? So having plans where it's like, this I will do, but this I'll only do if, right? The only doing if bit is very important, and not all frameworks and processes are set up in a way that actually allows you to do that based on internal policies. So sometimes it requires those policy shifts as well. So we had a new SOP written up for this specific piece of work. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's very good insight. I think especially, let's say, if everybody could just make sure that, let's say, prioritization is important, let's say, for any kind of role and any kind of function. And of course, as with functional roles, you get requests from different internal stakeholders as well. I mean, that's the same with market access, right? Suddenly, let's say marketing is coming, or an affiliate or whoever. That's the same with statisticians, but assuming that either position or function basically knows what is most important, firstly, for the other role, it's probably the wrong approach, I would say. I think it's then rather really, let's say, making aware, or let's say put everybody into the kind of seat that they at least get into that kind of communication to speak about the right kind of, let's say in the right way, in order to really be able to prioritize, let's say, the work. And I think your examples were, I think, really, really helpful. Moving a bit towards the end of the podcast, I normally have as a last question always a bit of a future or what if kind of thingy. And of course, I mean, we all know, I mean, AI is taken in an even more prominent role, I think, every day, I would say. And I think especially as you have also worked not only in HOR and market access statistics, but also in real world evidence, for example, I think you can probably maybe picture a bit how you would see how the collaboration between statisticians and market access managers, but maybe also generally the roles in conjunction with AI might be looking in the next decade. So maybe by, I don't know, 2035.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. And so maybe I'll answer it like this, right? So let's say from a statistical perspective, I think it will be a challenge. So obviously AI for support with programming, these kinds of things, it's very, let's say, advanced already. So obviously as a tool to support statisticians, programmers with the work that they do, I would assume everyone uses it, and I hope they do. But I guess traditionally when you think of statistics, right, they don't like automation. They like making decisions themselves. They like assessing methods themselves. They like doing all this themselves, because let's say there's an art to it as well, as also you always want to make sure that everything is being done correctly and rigorously and statistically correct. And so there's obviously always going to be this position of lack of trust of what AI would do, right? And I think that's going to be a challenge, and probably for quite a while, because these challenges pre-existed even before AI, when you wanted to try and maybe automate analyses simply. So things that are very easily repeatable, like let's say subgroup analyses, even that is a difficult thing to convince a statistical team to adopt, right? So that's maybe on that side, it would be quite challenging. On the let's say HOR rule of evidence side, I think there's a lot more opportunity to kind of integrate these things, and there are already lots of tools available online for things, even for things like gathering background research on what you're doing. You can get AI to think about model structures and these kinds of things. And I think there have been publications showing that you could even make it, maybe build an Excel model or something, I think. But obviously as a tool to support people in doing their work, AI would definitely have a prominent role. I see a lot of benefits to AI in the medical writing side. I think there's probably a lot more to be leveraged on that side as well, or kind of putting concepts together from different documents, different source documents. But I think there are obviously lots of advances with AI, and yeah, I'm always excited to see what the next thing is. And I think with kind of all of these kind of AI agents and these kinds of things, I think there's a lot that can be achieved. On the real world evidence side, I think because real world evidence is kind of was a lot more prone to automation to start with, right? So I think AI tools in real world evidence is a very quick and easy win, and I think it was going to add a lot of value into kind of better understanding burden of disease, healthcare resource use with patients, because data is usually in a very standardized format. Many things are very programmatic. So, how you identify particular patients with a particular disease, like you use the ICD codes and so on. So all of this it was very easy to automate beforehand. So now with AI, it should be very easy to kind of even run through analyses. And I think, let's say for a given database with RWE, there's much less variety in terms of methodological options, let's say, that you could adopt, so you can apply standards. So it's a mixture of automation and AI, let's say, but there's certainly a lot of value in there. And obviously, yeah, everything else, everyone should really think about how they implement AI within their workflows. But that's kind of from more like the technical perspective. That's what I can think of mainly. My experience has generally been a bit mixed. So, simple things, yes. Complicated things. So I think the challenge with AI as well is that, it's not just using ChatGPT, right? You have to get into the actual programming of it to actually leverage the full power. So I think that's the bit where, everyone needs to sort of become an AI programmer a bit to be able to do the AI properly, because, everyone will find they'll use ChatGPT and they'll think, oh, this is rubbish, right? But it's only rubbish because it's the way ChatGPT works, because it doesn't read properly, it doesn't do this properly. And then you have to use a combination of different things and leverage AI for the specific bits that AI is good at. And you need to manually or automate the rest with a bit of code or things like that. So
exactly, no, fully agree with that. No, perfect. Necdet, we're basically done. Thanks a lot for your time. That was really insightful. I think it was very lively. I think people should have really gotten a lot out of it, where and how to best, let's say, lever the various, let's say, expertise, plus how to best, let's say, communicate with each other, especially in the area we're acting in. So I think that was really helpful, very insightful. So thanks a lot for your time. And
thank you for inviting me, Stefan. It was a pleasure.
Statistics in market access is key. I think that's probably what we all know, but a lot of times it's also and especially about communication between the different roles, meaning statistics and health economics / market access, or maybe even real world evidence. I think that's an important consideration. I think Necdet has explained that as well very well, with different kind of important considerations, also more from a technical or task perspective. But I think key takeaways for me are quite clearly different roles obviously speak kind of different languages, and there's a very important educational piece in it, meaning we would need to explain and speak closely to the other role. In this case, I'm more coming from market access, maybe speak with a statistician, explain why I need that. I think just from my own experience when I was in the pharma industry, I also try to have at least one coffee per week with the statisticians I was working quite regularly, even if I maybe didn't need any kind of analysis during that week or even month. It was just important to explain what you do, where you stand. It was also easier to understand then from their perspective where we are or maybe why we need it. And that is also obviously what is very, very helpful. The other way around is obviously as well true. If I understand, let's say, why maybe it takes a bit longer, why maybe other analyses are as well, let's say, considered into the kind of timetable of a statistician, or why I maybe need to have first, let's say, write it up, why and in which ways I need it, kind of a protocol, then I can also do that and also plan that more appropriately, which would also mean basically going into that kind of prioritization point, what Necdet also mentioned. I think ultimately, what I also thought was very important, that's also basic key points of conflict, but I would also turn it around and maybe put that rather in a positive tone, like use that in the messages across different functions. What do they want? What do they need to have it? And how do they basically ask? And if everybody of us basically taking that into consideration, I think we'll have also all of the analysis and all of the data right in time, also in the way that we can digest and also explain it.
That was an episode of MAP, the Market Access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. MAP is available every second week with a new episode, so watch out. And in case you might have questions, contact me directly and or visit our website on www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de.